You're watching Worldview on France 24, and this is the France 24 debate. I'm Mark Owen. We're examining today the situation in Gaza as diplomatic efforts are being stepped up to find a way somehow towards a truce. This as the death toll continues to go up. Overnight, there were deaths in Gaza City as Israel continued to bomb areas around the Al-Shifa hospital. The death toll of Palestinians since October the 7th is now almost 32,000 and counting. Rafah in the south of Gaza has been struck this Wednesday in spite of warnings from the international community about what this could represent in terms of humanitarian catastrophe. Antony Blinken, meanwhile, is in Saudi Arabia. This is his sixth regional visit since the war broke out when Hamas attacked Israeli civilians, killing some 1,200 and taking at least 250 hostage. So the US Secretary of State touching down in Saudi Arabia. On the subject of hostages, the plight of the remaining 135 in captivity remains a headline story and an embarrassment for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, whose pledge to bring them home rings hollow for the families who fear for the safety of their loved ones still held by the terrorists somewhere underground in Gaza. So a special France 24 debate. Our guests to discuss the situation. We have joining us from Tel Aviv, Itamar Rabinovich, who's founder and president of the Israel Institute, former ambassador of Israel to the USA, president emeritus of Tel Aviv University. Thank you very much, sir, for being with us. In Paris, John Linden, executive director of the Alliance for Middle East Peace. John, thanks for joining us. In Jerusalem, France 24's correspondent, Catherine Norris-Trent, who's been covering all developments for us. Catherine, thanks for being with us. And here in the studio, Keraman Gojestani, our international affairs editor, to give us her take on the situation too. Keraman, great to see you as always. Before we let our guests loose on this topic, we turn to the fate of 1.5 million people in Rafah. Their fate hangs in the balance. Many, of course, are refugees, displaced numerous times by the Israeli bombardment of the Gaza Strip. Benjamin Netanyahu is not heeding the words of the international community, who say that any stepped-up military action there will take many civilian lives. Here at France 24, Yinka Oyatadi with this.
Rafah is home to 1.4 million people, many of whom were pushed out of their homes in northern Gaza by Israel's ground operations there. The displaced are fearing the same fate again, as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu insists he's pushing forward with plans for an assault on Rafah, this despite pleas from Washington for the whole thing to be called off.
I made it clear to the president that we are determined to complete the elimination of these battalions in Rafah. And there is no way to do it other than a ground invasion.
Netanyahu's comments come less than a day after Biden cautioned against a ground invasion in a call with the Israeli leader. Washington says such a move would be a mistake and that Israel could achieve its military aims, namely rooting out Hamas operatives, by other means. The White House is set to reiterate those calls in a meeting early next week between US and Israeli officials. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has joined the chorus of opposition. She says military action could have even more catastrophic consequences for civilians. Qatar, a key mediator in ongoing ceasefire talks, fears the operation would also set negotiations back.
We do believe, of course, and we have said this countless times, that any attack on Rafah would hamper any efforts to get a deal. It would be a humanitarian catastrophe within what is happening right now in Gaza. We are talking about around 1.5 million Palestinians crammed into 10% of Gaza. We already...
Despite those warnings, Qatari officials say they are cautiously optimistic following a meeting with Israel's intelligence chief to secure a 6-week truce.
Yinka Oyatadi there. Let's just give you the words of Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu this very day. He says he's authorized the IDF's ground invasion of Gaza's southern city of Rafah, where, as we've been hearing, millions of displaced Palestinians are sheltering. This all in spite of Joe Biden warning against it. Netanyahu said there was no alternative to the plan.
While we prepare to enter Rafah, and it will take some time, we continue to operate at full force. We continue to operate in Han Yunis, in the central camps, in eliminating and capturing senior Hamas leaders, as we do now in Shifa, in eliminating many hundreds of terrorists. As I committed time and time again, we are determined to achieve total victory, and we will achieve it.
Let's go straight to Jerusalem. Our correspondent Catherine Norris-Trent for the first assessment of the situation. Catherine, give us the sense of how things are there. What is the mood?
Well, the mood varies, of course, depending on who you speak to. Opinions very divided in this region. It's no exaggeration to say. In Israel itself, public opinion is divided over Benjamin Netanyahu, if not the Israel's war against Hamas. I mean, there's still strong public support for going after and eradicating Hamas. We're not even 6 months on from the 7th of October, and this country is still in shock. A lot of people still traumatized. A lot of people knew those who were killed. And you're seeing increasing numbers coming out on the streets every Saturday and sometimes in between to voice their discontent that there hasn't been a deal done yet to bring the hostages home. And also increasingly, we're seeing people on the streets who are calling for elections, calling for Netanyahu to go. So there's that feeling of swelling discontent there, while at the same time, it's not an anti-war movement by any means. Whereas if you travel around the West Bank and people we managed to get hold of to, of course, in Gaza, well, it's just a completely different view. People feel abandoned, that the rest of the world is not listening to them, a huge sense of despair and disbelief, really, that the situation has got so bad, and people wondering just how long this can go on. And of course, you know, I've been speaking to a lot of humanitarian workers here in the Middle East, trying desperately to get aid into Gaza, and they are overwhelmed by the scale of the job. It's just a huge job for them to try and meet the needs of the people in Gaza. So for them, a military operation in Rafah, which would involve first an evacuation of the population there, just seems, well, pretty much impossible.
Catherine, for now, thank you very much indeed for giving us that introduction to the discussion ahead. Let's bring in from Tel Aviv, Itamar Rabinovich, who's founder and president of the Israel Institute. Itamar, thank you very much for being with us. We appreciate your time here in France 24, and we'll give you time and space to express yourself, sir. Give us your sense of what is happening now, what is going to happen next.
Well, there's a question that many of us Israelis are asking. In my view, the whole debate about invading Rafah or not invading Rafah is taken out of context, and the context is how does Israel view the end of this war, and how does it view what is now became a commonplace the day after? I mean, this war has lasted longer than all of our wars, except our War of Independence, and it seems that the government has not defined how it wants it to end and how it envisages the Gaza Strip in the aftermath of the war. And just capturing Rafah doesn't respond to these questions. Of course, President Biden lay on the table a whole plan for governing Gaza, administering Gaza, renegotiating or restarting the negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia, and building an anti-Iranian coalition in the Middle East. This is a fairly attractive vision, and the question that many of us Israelis are asking is, why is our government not joining it?
Do you agree with Benjamin Netanyahu, who says there's no alternative plan now? The attack on Rafah must go ahead? Or do you agree with Antonio Guterres, who's saying no, it should not?
Well, as I say, I personally believe that it makes to me little sense to attack Gaza without a context. I understand very much the will of Netanyahu and many Israelis to see Hamas gone. After all, we must remember what happened on October 7, the atrocities and so forth. And we cannot envisage a Gaza in which Hamas continues to play a role. But just attacking Rafah will not bring us to that point.
Itamar Rabinovich, thank you for now. Let's bring in John Linden of the Alliance for Middle East Peace. John, Antonio Guterres said that Rafah happened in a certain context. It didn't happen in a bubble. There are reasons why it happened. But I don't think anybody would begin to say that what happened was justified in any way, shape or form. It was an atrocity. In terms of what we're seeing now, though, with over almost 32,000 Palestinians killed so far in what has happened, where do you see the next move? What do you think the next move should be? What would you like to see happen now?
Well, I think it's not an original observation. I and almost everybody I know would like to see the negotiations taking place in Doha right now conclude with this ceasefire for hostages deal, which would give a minimum of 42 days. We're hearing reports of pause in fighting, and at least 40 of the hostages who've been now, in the 6th month of captivity in Gaza, released. And I think really importantly, allowing the Gaza Strip to be flooded with humanitarian aid to really do whatever we can to disrupt the risk of famine that we've been hearing about this week. I mean, these are things that very practically could be achieved in the coming days if sufficient pressure is applied, to be very blunt, on both Hamas and on the government of Israel to conclude a deal, because I think everybody else in the world is convinced that's what needs to happen. And the details are important, and negotiations will go down to the wire on those details, but we can't allow further weeks to pass. It's over 6 weeks, I think, now since Bill Burns, the director of the CIA, was in Paris to begin these discussions. And, those 6 weeks have resulted in further catastrophe for the Israeli hostages and obviously for the civilian population in Gaza. I think the other thing that needs to happen then within that pause, which hopefully will become a permanent ceasefire, is the kind of approach that Ambassador Rabinovich there mentioned around this wider regional diplomatic initiative that can really look at resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to move away from the paradigm of conflict management and to really widen the lens and look at this wider regional security aspect to create real material incentives for Israelis, but also to give Palestinians a diplomatic horizon they can believe in. So they can really see that diplomacy and non-violence can result in an end to military occupation and self-determination for the Palestinian people.
And that sounds fantastic, John, doesn't it? But the big problem, of course, that people in Rafah are concerned about now is what happens next there, with Netanyahu saying that there's no alternative, that operation against Rafah needs to go ahead. What is your sense about what happens there? The international community, it seems, is helpless. No matter what is said, Netanyahu is actually fixed on his aim.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think our other guests maybe will have a better sense of the kind of internal Israeli political machinations on this. I do wonder whether there's some brinksmanship going on here. We saw that Netanyahu, in the clip that you played earlier, is saying that, he's approved a plan, but he's also said that it will take some time. He's agreed for a team from the Israeli Defense Ministry to visit DC, but from what I hear, they're not rushing to Washington. And so there is a kind of a timeline being extended. I do worry a little bit that maybe he's trying to use President Biden as a foil, and then if this operation doesn't take place in Rafah, he's able to blame the United States, President Biden, the international community on the sort of, total victory he's been promising not being concluded. And that would actually be no bad thing, in my view, if that's what prevents the kind of operation we've been hearing about taking place. But wall to wall, in the same way that I mentioned about the ceasefire for hostages deal, I haven't heard a single leader internationally, from left to right, European, Arab world, North American, South American, nobody thinks an operation in Rafah with 1.2 million displaced people and with real issues around the humanitarian situation and the possibility of famine, nobody thinks a military operation like that is a good idea. And I suspect there are people in the Kiryat, the Israeli military headquarters, who also think it's not a good idea. What we would really need is people to speak directly to the Israeli people and explain, perhaps over Prime Minister Netanyahu's head, why this is not in Israel's best interest, never mind the poor people who are currently in Rafah.
John, thank you. Bear with us, please. Before we bring in Keravan Gorgistani, let's hear from the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres speaking at a UN-EU meeting which took place in Brussels. Guterres said this Wednesday he urged Israel to ensure that humanitarian aid could reach Gaza, speaking alongside European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. Guterres called for international support to UN's efforts in the enclave.
Today, more than half of the population, over 1 million people, are facing catastrophic hunger, according to the scientific classification that was recently published. And so we must act now before it is too late. I call on the Israeli authorities to ensure complete and unfettered access for humanitarian goods throughout Gaza, and for the international community to fully support our humanitarian efforts.
Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, speaking a little earlier. Keravan Gorgistani is with us, our International Affairs Editor. You may all remember Keravan, of course, as our Washington correspondent for many years. Can I call on your experience on the Washington side of things? Because clearly, we're led to believe that what is said in Washington carries weight in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, with the Israeli government. However, one is left with the feeling that is no longer really the case, because Biden is saying, get your foot off the gas, decelerate this situation. Netanyahu is saying only today there is no other alternative other than attacking Rafah. What do you read is going on between the lines between these two men?
Look, Joe Biden and the White House and the Democrats in general have sort of evolved over the course of these past nearly 6 months now. At the beginning, you had one clear message: Israel has the right to defend itself, and we will stand by Israel. And over the course of these months, you saw an evolution of their position. First, regarding the situation on the ground, and also, and John was talking about the inside politics in Israel, there's also inside politics in the United States, and there's that pressure from the left wing of the Democrats that are criticizing Joe Biden for being too close to Israel. And so you've seen the Americans or the administration trying to sort of tone down that support for Israel and use a little bit harsher rhetoric, growing and growing. And over the past week, that rhetoric has really jumped, if you will, because you had that speech by the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. He's also the #1 elected Jewish person in the United States in U.S. politics. He came out in a speech where he basically said that Israel would be better off holding elections and getting rid of Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu responding, saying, "We're not a banana republic. A sister democracy should not be talking about replacing a leadership." That said, he's talking about the U.S. Infringing on the Israeli democracy. Benjamin Netanyahu is possibly right now speaking to Senate Republicans over a video link, and there is talk in the U.S. Congress that he might be invited in person to speak to the House. The House is, of course, led by the Republicans, and so you're seeing that the Republicans are also using this as a political tool. There is a growing rift clearly between Joe Biden and his administration and Democrats and Benjamin Netanyahu. And the Republicans and Benjamin Netanyahu are sort of using that to their own goals. And the question really is for the Biden administration: you can talk all you want, you can receive a team from the Israelis, you can give them your advice, give them your position, but at some point, if you don't put any consequences to not following that advice, these are just words. And it seems that, at least for now, Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't feel like he has any incentive in following that advice.
Keravan, thank you very much indeed. Please stay with us. Let's bring back in Ambassador Itamar Rabinovich, former ambassador of Israel to the United States. Itamar, you were talking earlier about a context regarding Rafah. Clearly, there is a context regarding any conversation that Benjamin Netanyahu has with Joe Biden, and any conversation or speech he makes to Republicans in Washington. Do you have a sense that Benjamin Netanyahu is in fact an obstacle, as Chuck Schumer said, an obstacle towards peace? Or does the United States have that wrong?
Well, it's I don't know that he is an obstacle for peace, but as an Israeli, I myself would like to see elections in the fall. Public opinion polls show that Netanyahu will be losing these elections, but you know, this is a long time and things happen, and polls can be misleading. We are in the shadow of 2 elections, and Netanyahu is preparing for an election, and he's building his position as, I am the only one who can stand up to the United States or to President Biden and prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. He is catering to an Israeli public opinion that, under the impact of October 7, went to the right. And of course, President Biden has his own election to think of, and Donald Trump is beginning to make his voice heard as well. I can only say that as an Israeli who has worked on the Israeli-American relationship for many years now, I very much hope that the rumors of Netanyahu going to Washington as a guest of the House Republicans to speak to the House would be a grave mistake. He did it once when he went to speak to both houses of Congress against President Obama's Iranian policy. That was a big mistake, and I hope it is not repeated.
Itamar Rabinovich, please bear with us, sir. Thank you very much indeed. Let's bring back in Catherine Norris-Trent, our correspondent who's been covering all developments for us since the start of this conflict. Catherine is joining us live from Jerusalem. Catherine, welcome back into the debate. Your input always extremely valuable at all times, but especially here where we're looking for any kind of insight as to what happens next, any kind of feeling. There's the issue about the hostages, of course, which is something we need to talk about. Clearly, this is something that is a bit of an embarrassment, to say the very least, for Benjamin Netanyahu, who promised once upon a time to bring them back and then seemed almost ambivalent about their fate. And now there's still a situation where, of course, they're being held and families are really unhappy. And I know that you've met some of those families.
I have indeed, Mark. I've been speaking to them ever since October. In fact, just this morning, I was interviewing parents of a victim of the Nobel festival. So not a hostage family, but people who have been deeply, deeply impacted by the 7th of October and its aftermath. Look, the hostages' families and their demonstrations and all the people who are deeply moved by this is becoming a political problem for Benjamin Netanyahu, because they keep on coming out on the streets. They block highways in Tel Aviv. They've burst into Knesset committees. They're being very vocal because they think this is the only way that they can get their loved ones back. And indeed, there are splits within the Israeli government. There are some members of the current ruling coalition on the far right. I'm thinking, for example, of the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich. He said basically that the delegation that's in Qatar now, the Israeli delegation, shouldn't be going back there at all. They should keep on fighting, because he said that the Hamas proposals that have been put forward were so ridiculous. So you've got basically people saying, look, we shouldn't negotiate, some of them, or saying we should fight on and eradicate Hamas. And that's very, very difficult for these hostage families and these people who've been through hell to hear. So they're trying to keep up pressure on their side. And it is a real dividing line in Israel, because even when you go to some of these protests of the hostage families, there's regularly people who totally disagree with them, who think that Israel shouldn't sign any kind of deal to release these hundreds or perhaps up to 1,000 more Palestinian prisoners who come and berate them in the streets. So you can see just how raw the emotions are and how deep the dividing lines are. And that goes through not only on the street of these protests, but right through the current Israeli government as well.
Catherine, you're on the inside. You're seeing it for us. You're our eyes and our ears on the ground. Thank you very much indeed for giving us that sense of how things are there where you are. Catherine Norris-Trent, our correspondent, joining us live from Jerusalem. Thank you, Catherine, very much indeed. Let's now hear some official word from Hamas. It comes via the Palestinian Islamist group's media office. Hamas, just to remind you, classed as a terror group by the US, the UK and the EU. Osama Hamdan expressed a negative view of the negotiations so far.
The mediators informed us yesterday evening, on Tuesday, March 19th, of Israel's stance on the position presented by Hamas, which was submitted on Thursday, March 14th. Israel's response was generally negative and doesn't respond to the aspirations of our people and their resistance.
Hamdan of Hamas. With us here in the debate, we have Itamar Rabinovich in Tel Aviv, founder and president of the Israel Institute. John Linden in Paris, he's executive director of the Alliance for Middle East Peace. Keravan Gorgistani, our international affairs editor. Great to see you, Keravan, as always. Let's bring in Itamar and John on for a reaction to the words from Osama Hamdan there. Itamar, can I get a sense from you as to whether you think there is any kind of compromise that Hamas is willing to make in order to basically save the lives of their own people?
To begin with, let me mention that we are not discussing the release of all hostages, just about 40.
Yes.
Women, elderly, and so forth. So, not all 140 or so hostages are alive.
An important
precision.
decision,
We don't know how
thank
many
you.
are alive, but some would remain in captivity. Second, this is the trump card that Hamas is holding, and they want to hold on to it. The whole attitude to this negotiation is negative, and Hamdan, beyond uttering negative words, did not become specific. They did put forward, indeed, an unacceptable proposal. We'll see during the coming days whether they would mend their position or not. But the basic attitude, as I see it, by Yahya Sinwar, their leader, and the leadership is that they are not interested in the deal now because they would like to continue to hold this trump card in their hands.
So what you're saying is that it doesn't matter precisely what is said at any negotiation, Hamas won't compromise.
Well, they are subject to pressure. They can be pressured by Egypt, they can be pressured by Qatar, or by Israel. And I think part of Mr. Netanyahu's posturing that he's about to attack Rafah is a form of pressure on Hamas. Let's say, if you make the deal, there will not be an attack on Rafah because it would mean at least 40 days of ceasefire. If you do not make a deal, there will be an attack on Rafah. So I'll give him the credit that this is also an effort to exert pressure on Hamas to make the deal that is on the table.
Itamar Rabinovich, thank you very much indeed. Please stay with us.
Let's
bring in John Linden for a reaction again to Osama Hamdan's words. And just to remind people, John, we're currently in the holy month of Ramadan. So people who are under fire are also trying to mark a religious time of great celebration. But of course, this is in circumstances that they never envisage being in. And it's obviously increasing their distress, which is already immeasurable. Let's be very straight about the situation. In terms of what Hamas has done and what Hamas is doing, do you feel they have, I'll just say it, do you feel they have in their hearts the well-being of their people? Or do you feel there is some kind of issue that is purely and simply something within their political sphere that they want to advance? Where do they stand?
I mean, I can categorically say that they're not motivated by the well-being of their people. That's very, very clear. But they are also motivated by other concerns, regional ones, as was mentioned. You know, they have pressure points where, you know, significant pressure can be applied by Qatar and Egypt, as was mentioned. We saw it leaked in recent days that the US had discussed with Qatar very early on in the war, at Qatar's suggestion, the idea of Hamas being expelled from Qatar. I don't think it's an accident that that ended up in the press. And they're also, perhaps most importantly, vulnerable to pressure from below. Every Palestinian I know, when they speak to you candidly, are furious. I mean, some are ambivalent because obviously the situation is so grave for Palestinians. But we have over 30,000 dead Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, catalyzed by what Hamas did on October 7th. Now, their anger is greater, obviously, for Israel and in many respects for the international community. But you've seen protests in Gaza repeatedly in the north, the south, and the center against Hamas during this war. And actually, one thing that Israel could do, military pressure is obviously being applied. I'm skeptical as to whether that's going to produce a compromise this far into a war that has military pressure we've never seen before being applied. One thing they could do is let in journalists, because journalists have not been allowed into the Gaza Strip since October 7th, which is unprecedented in the history of this conflict. But I suspect there are an awful lot of Palestinians in Gaza who will be willing to say into a camera what they think of Hamas, who've been hiding in tunnels beneath their feet with food and supplies whilst they are at risk of famine and airstrikes. And I think also you saw in recent days, Fatah issued a pretty strong statement against Hamas, very belatedly in my view, but it was notable for the strength of the language in it. And I forget the exact quote, but sort of condemning Hamas for bringing this upon the Palestinian people. And I'd make one observation on this because I've seen it in the war in 2014, where I spent some time in Israel and in Gaza after the ceasefire. And that was the longest war we'd had before this one. And the level of anger amongst Palestinians to their own leadership and Israelis to their leadership after the guns had fallen silent. Everyone rallies around the flag during the war. It's normal. You see it in every war around the world. But afterwards, it can be a period of reflection. And I think there'll be a reckoning in both societies that really will potentially wipe away leaders, both Palestinian and Israeli, as a result. We want to make sure that that is given an opportunity to happen. And that's where Hamas's failings to look after the well-being of the people in Gaza do need to be exposed.
Truth and reconciliation. John, thank you very much indeed. Please stay with us. Keravan Gorgistani, may I bring you back in, please? Anthony Blinken has landed in Saudi Arabia. Our debate title, Blinken tours the Middle East to secure Israel-Hamas deal. Next move towards a truce? Question mark. It is a big question mark, isn't it? Give us a sense of what he's hoping to achieve.
Well, first of all, it's interesting that this trip was initially not including Israel. Israel was added once Tony Blinken had already landed in Saudi Arabia. So that in itself, they didn't explain why that discrepancy in the timing, but it's to be noted because usually those trips sort of started or were worked around Israel. This time it seems that it's the other way around. And I think in this case, there are two big elements that the administration is working on. One is, of course, or three maybe, if you will. One is, of course, this discussion about the ground operation in Rafah. That's the short term. Then there is the sort of medium term, which is the ceasefire negotiations as well as the release of hostages, which Tony Blinken is going to be working on because he's talking to some of these big Arab states that are involved in those negotiations. And then there's the long term, which is what happens next. And this big rift right now between the United States and many other countries in the world and Israel, which is the two-state solution. And that is something that the Americans have very publicly stated that they were displeased with the comments coming out of Benjamin Netanyahu, and they insist that the United States is very keenly focused on creating the sort of situation that would even allow for negotiating possibly a two-state solution, which right now doesn't seem like it is the case. And to jump on something that was said earlier about this question of whether Palestinians are against Hamas and whether Israel should be using that, the Americans are also criticizing Israel for not having a plan for how Gaza would be ruled after the war. Remember the sort of several points in the plan that Benjamin Netanyahu proposed for post-war Gaza. And one of the things that was really missing was, yes, we get rid of Hamas, we get rid of the current Palestinian Authority, but no real plan as to who would be allowed to step in and to be the Palestinian leadership, whatever you want to call it. And so that is something that the Americans are also, in a way, working on, even if this is, again, very long-term, because there are many other obstacles to go through before you can even start to think about post-war Gaza.
Indeed. So a very busy trip of intense negotiations for Antony Blinken, with no sense of whether there'll be any kind of progress. That's probably the big problem right now, isn't it? There's no sense that he's really going to make any progress in this.
Well, the mediators, so the Qataris, the Americans, are always trying to strike an optimistic tone, because if you go into a negotiation saying there's no way it's going to work, then you shouldn't even be negotiating. So they're trying to say, it's going to be very hard, but we believe that we can get there. And so they're pressing with the means that they have. And of course, the Americans used to have, maybe a little bit less right now, they have means of pressuring the Israelis or talking to the Israelis. The Qataris have a means to pressure Hamas. And I think everyone around them wants to see a solution, wants to see a negotiation. But again, it's in the nitty-gritty of the details of that agreement or that deal that the problem lies in, because everyone seems to agree that there should be some sort of truce. Everyone seems to agree that some of the hostages can be released and some of the prisoners can be released. But the question is, how many hostages, which hostages, how many prisoners, which prisoners, how long the truce, what happens after the first truce? All of those elements need negotiations. And some of the reporting from Israeli media pointed to Israeli officials themselves saying that this could take several weeks, if not more, for them to find some sort of an agreement.
Indeed. And as those weeks go by, does the bombardment continue? More death on the ground, almost 32,000 killed so far. Keravan, for now, thank you. Let's bring back in, for possibly a final comment, Itamar Rabinovich in Tel Aviv, founder and president of the Israel Institute, former ambassador of Israel to the US. Itamar, I'd be interested to hear your feeling about what happens next in the US, because obviously we have Blinken representing the Biden administration there now, but of course, if the election goes towards the Republicans, it will be a whole different ballgame, a whole different kind of negotiation going forward that we'll be looking at.
Yeah, this is why I think that perhaps the important element in Mr. Blinken's discussions in Saudi Arabia had to do with the question is, what would be the Palestinian component that the Saudis would insist on in order to normalize with Israel. If they insist that there be a Palestinian state right now, a two-state solution immediately, it would be a problem. If they agree to a milder formula, this could be an opening, and this could open the way to that larger vision. I mean, the Biden administration would like to see a major achievement in the Middle East before this election, actually before the spring, because once we are in the middle of the spring, this is high election season, and it's very difficult to implement a policy. So the Biden administration has its own timetable. It's in a hurry. And the Blinken visit to Saudi Arabia may have had something to do with that.
Itamar, we have word dropping on our computers here regarding Chuck Schumer, the US Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, declining a request by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to speak to the Senate Democratic Caucus. Itamar, could I get a comment from you about that? Chuck Schumer declining Netanyahu's request to speak to the Democratic Caucus.
I think he went further than that. I think that he openly called upon Mr. Netanyahu to leave office, to resign, to have an election. I mean, after that, declining to invite him to speak to a committee is a relatively minor step.
Itamar Rabinovich, thank you very much indeed, former Israeli ambassador to the USA. John Linden, time for a final comment from you. I think, sir, your feeling about the situation. I mean, clearly everyone wants the killing to stop. Everyone wants the deaths to stop, regardless of which side one is on or which side one takes. Here, of course, we're straight down the middle, trying to deal with the human issues and the negotiations and try to get sort of some fairness out of the situation. And I know that's where you're coming from. In terms of what happens next, sir, what do you want to see? What do you hope to see?
Well, I mean, we didn't address the report this week with the IPC certifying the famine may be imminent in the north of the Gaza Strip. I think that should focus everybody's attention. Everything we've seen up until now would be only a prelude to the sort of tragedy that is possible if famine conditions arrive. That, if nothing else, should create the sense of urgency that diplomats should feel. And maybe one other observation is just that we've talked a lot about elite level diplomacy and political machinations. We have to also put the human beings, the Israeli and Palestinian citizens who are traumatized, right at the center of our calculations. Whatever Secretary Blinken discusses with the Saudis or with Bibi, there are millions of traumatized Israelis and Palestinians who will need to be stakeholders in any diplomatic process and any final status agreement. And I encourage Secretary Blinken, Europeans, Israeli, Palestinian leaders to think about a strategy that can put civil society, Israeli-Palestinian partnership at the core of the sort of long-term process that's going to be required to underpin any diplomatic agreement on a piece of paper and make it stick and make scenes like we're seeing on our televisions right now impossible to envision in the future.
John, I've taken an executive decision and I'm buying 5 more minutes for us to talk because it's important what you mentioned about the famine situation. I mean, clearly there's been a warning about this for a long time. The UN has said that it's been blocked in terms of trying to get its aid into the Gaza Strip. I mean, this situation needs to be resolved for the greater good of those people sheltering from the bombardment.
Yeah, I mean, this should go above politics or above whether, you know, your opinion is on permanent ceasefire, pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian. Famine is famine is famine. We've had, I think, 2 famines declared in the 21st century so far. The IPC is the most credible body in the world for being able to measure the various criteria. They have said that they have hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in the north of the Gaza Strip that are in what they call phase 5 category. Now, to put that in context, there are nobody in Afghanistan, Somalia, or Sudan that is in phase 5, according to the IPC. These are some of the most acute issues around hunger elsewhere in the world. We saw Samantha Power, the US aid administrator in the United States, issue a very stark statement in recent days. Secretary Blinken said that 100% of the population of Gaza are suffering shortage of food. This, you know, again, beyond politics, we need to flood the Gaza Strip with food. Food is not a dual-use product. Food can only be used to nourish people. And, you know, for people saying that they don't want anyone to go to Hamas, I understand that. But if we're comfortable with collateral damage for weapons being used in a war where civilians will die, we should be comfortable with collateral nourishment where people who we don't like have food in their stomachs, whilst people we do care for also do. So I'd really urge everybody to put this above politics. Gaza's surrounded by Egypt and Israel and the Mediterranean Sea. all of those entry points should be used to get food to people who need it in the Gaza Strip.
Indeed, two boats are arriving on the Mediterranean as we speak. Clearly, there is moves to try to get food in, but it's getting it past and safely through, and obviously preserving the lives of the aid workers. That is another issue too. There's been a small group of Israelis holding a protest outside the headquarters of the United Nations Relief Agency for Palestinians, known as UNRWA, in Jerusalem. This happened early Wednesday. The protest organised by the South 9 movement, which over the last few weeks organised protests at different crossings with the Gaza Strip, hoping to block aid into the besieged enclave, the Gaza Strip. Israel has accused UNRWA staff of taking part in the October the 7th atrocities, so far, though, without providing any evidence of that. Israel's allies, though, have gone ahead and cut funding to the UN body that kept pre-war Gaza running. Among those who've cut funding, of course, is France. Itamar Rabinovich, can I bring you back in on that issue of aid, on that issue of famine, on the issue of getting things through to the people who need it? I imagine you agree, being a very human person, that this is something that needs to happen.
I'd like to see a very vigorous effort by my own government to expedite, to facilitate more humanitarian aid flowing through our own border, or to help those who bring it by sea or parachute it from the air. No question, it's a #1 priority.
Itamar, thank you. Ketevan, you've got 10 seconds. Final word.
I just wanted to double down on what John said about the lack of journalists, of independent journalists getting into Gaza. You have a few journalists who are there, but they are suffering the way everybody else is suffering in Gaza. And the journalists who get in as embeds of the Israeli army. And the need for independent journalists, for us, for my colleagues, to be able to go in there without any embed, with being able to talk to everybody there, would also be very important to bring out all this information that we are lacking right now as to exactly what happens when you have some of those tragic events that we've been reporting on.
If we need volunteers, I'm volunteering to go. I think it's essential to be there. Ketevan, thank you very much indeed. Ketevan Gurjestani, our International Affairs Editor. As always, thank you for your contribution. Thanks to John Linden, Executive Director of the Alliance for Middle East Peace. And thank you to Ambassador Itamar Rabinovich, founder and president of the Israel Institute, former ambassador of Israel to the United States. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate. Most of all, thanks to you, wherever you're watching us. And stay with us here in France 24. More to come.